And we're on.
Right, so we are calling our meeting to order. This is the House Environment and Energy Committee, and this afternoon we're going to be just hearing from bill introducers from different committees, and we're going to welcome Mike Rice, who's one of the sponsors of H673, an act relating to Vermont's outdoor recreation economy. Welcome, Representative Rice.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm Mike Rice, representative from Dorset, here to introduce you to H673, which is a bill that would sort of deepen our understanding of and commitment to outdoor recreation in Vermont. Pretty simple bill, three main components. The first is that it would direct VOREC in consultation with the Trails and Greenways Council to conduct an outdoor recreation economic impact study. We know that according to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, Vermont recently ranked second in terms of contributions to state GDP made by outdoor recreation, ranking only behind Hawaii. And that same data shows that outdoor recreation is responsible for nearly 5% of Vermont's economy. We need to dig deeper into what that means. And the study, as laid out in this bill, would examine the economic impact of outdoor recreation on a county level, how the impact is distributed across different activities, the carrying costs of stewardship, trail stewardship, and opportunities for growth, among other things. The second thing the bill would do is build staff capacity at the Trails and Greenways Council, which supports trails and outdoor recreation community and serves as an advisory body to the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. New staff position would execute that statutory role, develop and manage and deploy technical assistance resources for council members, and sort of continuously assess the needs of the trail stewardship community in Vermont. And then finally, the third thing the bill does is direct FPR and VTGC to bring in a contractor to develop a set of universal trail best management practices to ensure that all public access trails throughout the state are built and maintained to a high standard, protect both our economic and ecological interests in outdoor recreation throughout Vermont. And that's about it. So happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you for that, Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for this. Just a question. This is just state sponsored trails, right? Not like VASA or VAST.
So the Trails and Greenways Council is made up of member organizations that represent all the different activities that are done on trails. And so it would bring all those into account. But it's not sort of proposing any kind of construction of trails or anything like that. It's just sort of setting up taking into account what's needed by that trails community, all those different organizations, and then establishing sort of those management practices that would be best deployed across the state.
Because those are like paid for by dues, like VAST and VAST are paid for by dues.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how much the state would have an effect on. And it's obviously summer goes over private lands. So I don't know how that would affect. I'm just curious as to how that would affect those organizations.
Yeah, and I'm sure that those organizations would be brought in as stakeholders to the process and to answer questions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Representative Pat.
Thank you. So you mentioned the positions that will be funded in this bill.
Yeah, so there are a couple of appropriations in the bill, one of which is to fund staff capacity.
And that will be through appropriation as opposed to fees of some kind.
That's correct.
Thank you.
You know how many staff there are at the Trails and Greenways Council now?
My understanding is that there is one staff member at the Trails and Greenways Council, and that there's a lot of sort of donated labor from the member organizations to sort of stand up a lot of the work that the council does. I wouldn't want to promise that that's that one staff member, but I believe that that's what they have. Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, one more
I
question.
just thought about that. Thank you for information. Doesn't the Green Mountain Club and other organizations already have this in mind, maintaining trails and making sure the trails are improved?
Yeah, I think that the idea here is that there are a lot of sort of different regional organizations that are managing the stewardship of different kinds of trails. And it would be really good to sort of collectively come up with a statewide plan for what are the best management practices to make sure that trails are sort of ecologically beneficial and managed for the long
Would
term.
this be something that these other groups throughout the state are going to answer to?
I'm not sure of the mechanism in terms of answering to, you know, it's a best management practices. It's a guide essentially that would be created. But I'm sure that, you know, could hear from organizations like that to see sort of where they think that there might be overlap.
Okay.
Did you work with other organizations? Who did you work with to develop the bill?
So over the summer, sort of stakeholders from the Trails and Greenways Council, their membership organizations, Mountain Bike Association, for instance, as well as FPR and legislative colleagues came together. Yeah.
Representative Thorne.
Just a quick question for you on current funding, if there is any, for stewardship.
So my understanding is that there's not sort of established consistent funding for stewardship. And this is, you know, this bill, I think, really gets at the fact that there's a lot of sort of excitement and often private funds for the development of new trails and building out trails, and that we really need to sort of answer that with that consistency around stewardship too.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming in.
Yeah.
Next up, we will welcome Catherine Sims, one of the sponsors on H 719, an act relating to housing development and unit rehabilitation. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Catherine Sims from Craftsbury, Orleans 4. Excited to be here to talk with you about H 719 and act relating to housing development and unit rehabilitation. And delighted to be joined by one of my co-sponsors, Representative Bartley. So I think, as you all know, we are in a housing crisis, and there is a need for more housing across the state for all family sizes, income levels, and service needs. And so H 719 is a housing bill that builds on the work that we all did together last year around the Home Act. As you all remember, we made historic investments in housing to support new construction, fix up vacant units, expand shelter capacity, all while making meaningful changes to land use regulations. And those changes are already having an immediate impact in my backyard, in my community, because of the by right language that you included in the bill. St. Johnsbury now has a long overdue warming shelter. And thanks to the investments included in the bill, rental units are being brought back online in Hardwick, and the Sacred Heart property up in Newport is finally scheduled for redevelopment. And yet it hasn't been enough. Vacancy rates continue to remain at all-time lows, and housing prices continue to soar. And so we must continue to confront our housing challenges head on. As this committee knows well, Act 250 has been really instrumental in sustaining the Vermont we love, balancing the preservation of our unique landscape with the developmental needs of our communities. I don't think any of us want to see more sprawl. We don't want to see houses in the middle of farm fields or enormous single-family homes on the top of ridge lines. And yet, I think we also know that we haven't been building housing at a pace to keep up with current demand. And so if we want more smart growth, like rehabbing existing buildings and building new infill development in our walkable downtowns and villages that are served by water and sewer, we need to continue to modernize our land use regulations. As the NRB study recommends, we could consider a tiered approach where we provide additional protections to our most ecologically important natural resource areas and provide greater exemptions in the places where we want to encourage smart growth. With all that in mind, H 719 would make investments in the housing programs that we know are working while contemplating some additional new ones, and would continue to modernize our land use regulations to promote smart growth housing development. Since I only have a few minutes to introduce a 40-page bill, I'll do a very high-level overview of what's in it. You all spent a fair amount of time thinking about the 1055 Act 250 trigger last year. This bill continues to recommend some modifications to that, raising the cap from 10 to 30 and reducing the year constraint to 2 years for housing projects outside designated areas, but that are served or feasibly served by water and sewer, along with regionally approved municipal zoning. And it would reduce the constraint to 2 years for housing projects in all other areas. It proposes 2 exemptions to Act 250, housing or mixed-use development in all of our state designated areas, an additional half-mile radius outside of those designated areas, and also exempting hotel or motel properties converted into permanent housing. Building on the conversation that this committee had around municipal delegation last year, this bill would task the NRB with establishing a process by which a municipality is delegated authority to review development and subdivisions in lieu of Act 250. And it would require a municipality to adopt high-quality zoning bylaws that are functionally equivalent to Act 250 to take advantage of that delegation option. The bill removes the requirement for prime ag soil mitigation fees for an alternative or community wastewater system that would serve development in a designated area to help do a small part to reduce the costs of providing that important water and sewer infrastructure to smaller communities. The bill contains some reforms to the appeals for housing development to narrow the scope of appeals, shift standing from any 10 persons to a 10% minimum of the town population, and to require more skin in the game with an appeal bond for folks trying to appeal housing development. Lastly, it would make some changes to municipal zoning and development review boards, including tightening timeframes to ensure timely decision-making, making some changes to parking and lot size to allow for more dense development, and building on the by right work that you all did last year for shelters. This would provide additional allowances for mental health and recovery facilities to have by right status within communities. The bill also has big sections on tax incentives and investments. The tax incentives would eliminate the annual cap in the state downtown and village center tax credit program. It would provide a property transfer tax exemption for rehab of properties for mixed income residential use, and provide a 5-year property tax valuation free for the rehabilitation of blighted properties to be rehabbed or converted for residential use. It has nearly $25 million in investments in one-time funding, again, for programs that we know are already working and a few new ones, including $250,000 for the Municipal Planning Grant Program, $6 million for VHIP, the Vermont Housing Improvement Program, $2 million for the Manufactured Home Improvement Repair Program, $1 million for the Healthy Homes Initiatives. It would establish a housing infrastructure revolving loan program at $8 million, provide $5 million to VHFA's Missing Middle Homeownership Development Program, which provided low-cost capital to the developers, and a $2.5 million investment in the Vermont State University for the Johnson campus rehabilitation of 50 units to be made available at HUD fair market rates. Many of these investments were included in the governor's address that we just heard. As you all know, any bill is a conversation starter, and we hope to continue a conversation with you all as you do your work around land use regulations and how that can help address our housing crisis. I'm happy to answer any questions if there's.
Thank you. Members have questions?
No.
Not seeing any. Thanks for coming in. Next up, we have Representative Buss with H716 Act relating to Act 250 transparency.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's my first time here. So for the record, I'm Representative Tesha Buss. I have permitted in both Act 250 and the Section 248 process, and I'm also a state rep for the town of Reading. And there was a 1,068-day-long permit process to replace pentapoles in Reading. In my study of the pentapole replacement case, it occasionally was challenging to follow because district coordinators did not always upload their letters written to the applicant. And so that what I had to do was reverse engineer from the applicant's response a determination of what was requested by the district coordinator. In the same case, it also went to environmental court twice, and those documents exist in a completely separate database than Act 250. And lawyers take classes to learn research, And so you can imagine that as a layperson investigating a case to see when I apply for Act 250, what I always do is I look at a similar business and then I study the permitting process to determine my risk exposure, because I have to answer the question, is it reasonable for me to find success in this permitting process for my business idea? And how better a way to do that than to study another process and to see where it went into court, where it may have ran into roadblocks. So this is a very important part of the permitting process to make sure that all the documents are extremely easy to find, so that we have greater transparency. It is important to know why a permit is denied or approved. Since district coordinators' jurisdictional opinions are not binding, there exists strong variances across districts. So applicants, as you imagine, are frustrated when they see a decidedly similar business permitted in one section of the state, while another is denied in another section of the state. So an articulation of reasoning in the opinions is a necessary tool to use to unify the commissions and coordinators. In order to obtain more equity amongst commissioners and coordinators, it is important that the NRB establish policies and procedures to address accountability and equity. Our judges have such a mechanism, and it is equally important that our quasi-judicial body comply with a similar practice. It is important to make it explicit in the decisions of the environmental court that they are binding. In this particular case for Pentapoles in Reading, there were many discussions about best management practices. And I discovered for the first time that a best management practice might be acceptable in the Public Utility Commission, but not in the Act 250 process. And not only do I believe that these best management practices should be accepted across permitting agencies, in this particular case, it was discovered that the environmental court had years before allowed the best management practice for the utility to not use the exact same hole to replace the pole, but to do it within 5 feet of each pole. So it was a binding court decision that wasn't accepted. So the applicant had to go to environmental court only to be told that the court had already made that decision in 2016. So what recourse is there for that applicant who went through an expensive environmental court process only to find out that the court had already accepted it? And furthermore, what recourse does any other applicant have for any other potential mistake from our district coordinators or commissions? And it is for this reason and others that governance amongst the commissions and coordinators must be addressed to increase transparency in this equity process. And then we come to cognizable change, which is defined as means any physical change or change in use that demonstrates significant impact on finding, conclusion, term, and condition of the project's permit. And so a literal interpretation of this rule that has been exercised by coordinators means any physical change. So this rule is incredibly important in a very different way from the pole placement that I've already described. But it is also so important because towns without zoning have to go through the jurisdictional opinion process to determine whether or not they can replace a roof, replace their sheathing, replace decking, replace a hot water heater and move it up to a heat pump hot water heater. And that's a 15 to 30 day turnaround each time that they have to go through a jurisdictional opinion. And so I encourage the committee to consider a language change to this rule. I know that you are also looking at other bills with dispositive permits, and this bill contains a slightly different version of how the Act 250 Commission or district coordinator would deal with a disagreement with a permitting agency. So right now, as an applicant, if the Act 250 coordinator disagrees with the agency's permit, typically that has to go through the court process to be resolved, which is not exactly a fair process for the applicant who thought they were doing their due diligence, bringing forth a permit and satisfying the criteria. So this bill puts forth a potential solution for how to manage those discrepancies without the applicant being involved in that process. And there are many times that an applicant believes that they have submitted an application that satisfies the criteria only to find that the district coordinator or commission have found it to be incomplete. And the coordinator produces a letter to the applicant stating why, and the applicant can request the same person to reconsider it once more. And so it stands to reason that if they thought it incomplete before, that they might find it incomplete again. And it is important that the NRB create a system to request reconsideration by bringing the request to a new set of eyes. And lastly, it's extremely important that the Act 250 process have deadlines and to not be an open-ended process, because justice delayed is justice denied. And the bill proposes that if the district coordinator deems the application incomplete and the applicant disagrees, the board shall review the application within 30 days and determine if all required information has been submitted and make a determination on completeness. As you can see, the bulk of this bill is about providing checks and balances and bringing greater transparency to the process. And I encourage the committee to take up any pieces and parts, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you for coming in. Representative Pat.
Thank you. I just want to be clear, because you used your own personal experience and example related to utility line location and Act 250, what you're talking about in the bill is Act 250 generally for any, yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. The example was just to show how the process can stale.
Because at least historically, the kinds of line location Act 250 projects have been relatively rare compared to things that are under the jurisdiction of the PUC. That may be changing, but and I think it was an example in your case, in your area. But I just want to be clear that we're talking about Act 250, any application that's coming before the district commission.
That is true. So that cognizable, I'm not for sure exactly how you say that. But yes, in rule, it can be literally interpreted as any change, not any change that may cause significant damage. And so that, I think, that language needs to be clarified so that that it's bulletproof in its interpretation. That's not what I really want to say, but I want to make sure it's tight.
Thank you.
I have a couple thoughts. I mean, one is that, we're looking at changes to the board, which would be kind of broader, but I think meet many of the goals that you have in this proposal that you've presented to us. And I'd be curious if you have read that, or if you want to. And I suggest maybe you do, because that's where we're looking at kind of a higher level administrative changes, I think, to bring some of that, what you're addressing, to all aspects of the Natural Resources Board program. And I guess I'm also just curious, we have a lot of towns that are still choosing to be 1 acre towns, and it sounds like Reading is. And if you have any insight into your towns that are still 1 acre towns, I'd be interested in hearing why they don't have zoning.
I know that Plymouth has zoning, Bridgewater does not. And so I know a few business owners that operate businesses in both locations. And they are particularly frustrated that they have to go through the Act 250 process. It is easier for them to go through the towns, particularly when it comes to repair and maintenance like issues that by this rule still seems to spark the any change situation. I have not asked them the question as to why they would like to stay that way. It seems to me that when you're talking about, even Plymouth has that downtown designation section. It is extremely small, about a block and a half. And my business is in the middle of that. So, it is a challenging process. And so I don't know why they would want to necessarily maintain the 1 acre zoning when, particularly in the town of Reading, most of the parcels are not even 1 acre for sure. And they have a lot of shared wells in downtown Reading. But to answer your other governance question, I do know that a lot of these concepts are being talked about in a different manner. And it's not the way in which they're done. It's just that if these are pointed out to be addressed, that would be that would be great in however way they get done.
Representative Sibilia.
To Representative Buss and I have connected work, but I want to thank Representative Buss for the in-depth work that she did to kind of unravel and the experience that she brought to that, which was really helpful all around. I appreciate the very specific fixes connected to very specific instances. Yeah, really.
Representative Torrey.
I don't know if you can answer this, but I'm just curious, like what the cost was of, like, in this example that you shared with us for the applicant.
You know, I was not the applicant in the Pentapole case. I have been to environmental court twice as a business owner. Once was very simple. You know, I wrote my lawyer wrote a brief, the other attorney wrote the brief, and then the judge made the decision, which just punted it right back to the town zoning board. They said, you know, a definition of outdoor recreational use didn't include weddings. So if I was going to do weddings on the property, I needed to have them include weddings as an example. The second time I was actually taken to environmental court with the state of Vermont, I had applied for a wastewater permit, and it was, my neighbor said it was going to contaminate their well. So for 6 months, I reached out with multiple suggestions. How can I address this? I even went to his house, sat down. I'm like, you and I have always been great neighbors. How can we resolve this? No, we have to go through the courts. So after all of those, sometimes the delay tactic would be they wouldn't answer our phone call for a month and a half. So then finally, this started in April. In October, I'm pregnant, my first trimester, and sitting in a 13-hour mediation. In which the state of Vermont had to go through and explain their wastewater permit and why it was sufficient and it had no variances whatsoever. And at the end of it, they said, well, if you pay him $25,000, you can buy half an acre of his land and you can move the wastewater slightly over and it will solve the problem. So I had to come up with $25,000 in 48 hours and pay $17,000 in attorney fees. And that was in 2013.
That ought to be illegal.
What?
That ought to be illegal.
I hear you. And you know, he came to me, my neighbor, about, I don't know, 3 or 4 months later, and he said, you know, when you came and you sat down and said we should work this out as neighbors, you were right, and I'm sorry. And I was like, thank you so much for that. He goes, I don't think that either of us won. And I was like, definitely not.
Representative Stebbins is joining us via Zoom and has her hand up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to call out that we all received an email, and I'm sorry I'm not there in person today to everybody presenting, but I am listening. Our committee did receive an email at some point this summer about sort of the flip situation, where an individual had a neighbor who placed, a water treatment for their waste facility in an area on the neighbor's property, but essentially what it means, because of how the hydrology within the aquifer works, is that it means that the next door neighbor can't use that property for drinking water for quite some time. And to be honest, that's what I've heard 4 or 5 times, just anecdotally, is the flip side. Someone placing, the sewer or sewage or the treatment system right up against their property line, so it actually impacts the neighbor more so. And so I'm sorry this happened to you, Representative, but I want to call out that it's not an anomaly. It's occurring both ways, clearly, and is important as we seek to look for ways to really be strategic and thoughtful about property ownership as well as housing. So thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thanks for coming in.
Thanks so much for having me.
Will be Representative Bongartz on H 652, an act relating to updates to the HUD Act.
Official.
All right. Welcome, Representative Bongartz.
Hello. Nice to see everybody. This is, you are a little kidding little table here. So this is a bill that was largely put together by the Department of Housing and Economic Development, looking at technical changes. And we knew there were going to have to be some from the Home Act. And I'll just run through a few of them really quickly. The first one in section 4414 really just makes clear that you bound up parking spaces, because remember the provision about 1.5 if you are further, if you're not within half a mile of it, and just making clear that it's rounded up to 1.5 parking spaces. The next section,
Rounded up to 1.5. Well,
I'm sorry,
what is that?
rounded up to the nearest whole number. So, because you can't have half a parking space.
That's why I was.
Yeah, so the half gets rounded up to 1. It's pretty basic, but there was apparently some confusion about
Down to 1?
up 1. If it was 1.5, if it was, let's say, it worked out that you needed 13.5 parking spaces, it translates to 14. Which is what we intended. So this is just a technical correction, making clear, because apparently there's been some confusion about that. The next section, which is in section 244.112, makes clear that when we're talking about ADUs, it does not include short-term rentals are not included and don't get the benefits that we intended to give to ADUs, and making more housing available for long-term renters. Just making clear that short-term rentals don't gain the benefits. There's also been there's an issue about with duplexes. Remember the whole duplex discussion last year. This bill does suggest that we go from making duplexes an allowed use to permitted use. And actually, I remember last year that we had a lot of discussion about this. So that's just there. It's not something, frankly, that I'm pushing. But the second part of that, down at the bottom, it makes clear though that when calculating, when you're looking at an ADU, the idea was that the ADU, our notion was that the ADU is counted really as a single family home. And this is making clear that no additional land or lot area is required than would be required for a single family home, because there's been some towns have looked at this and tried to require more lot size because it's 2 homes. And the idea was that it'd be treated the same as a single family home. And that's what this is now trying to clarify. The going down to sub 12 under the same section 4412. The idea here is to make clear that number one, the same thing, the minimum lot size of 1/5 of an acre, density and minimum lot size standards for duplexes and multifamily dwellings shall not be more restrictive than those required for single family dwellings. So it's sort of the same thing, but what this is referring back to, I think, is that remember the idea is that if you're in a downtown and you are on sewer and water, we wanted denser housing. And what this is saying in part is that you can't require large lot sizes, which can have the effect of thwarting our notion to have denser housing in downtowns. So, because large lot sizes make it impossible to build dense housing. Or harder to build dense housing. On the next one, the next change is in section 4303. It's just making clear that when we talk about served by municipal and water infrastructure, it doesn't count as available if there are physical or other constraints that prevent a feasible connection. Just clarifying that if you can't get there, it's not an area where it's considered available. So those are largely, by the way, on section, the next one is in 4465. This is not thought through, so I would say when it says that the determination has to be issued within 60 days after receiving the appeal, that's not realistic. And we'll talk about that later if we take this bill up. And if you go down to section 4382, this section, the sub 10, changes the word should to shall as it relates to municipalities using data on year-round and seasonal dwellings. So the RPCs have that data, and this actually puts some pressure on it indirectly on the RPCs to have that data, and then the towns actually must use it when developing policy. It's not that they should use it, they shall use it. The next section, the next change is in section 4442, when it removes entirely the ability for, put it another way, what it says is that, remember we changed the law last year, and I can't remember with how this worked with the exactitude, but about the bylaw changes, zoning changes having to go to a vote of municipalities. This just eliminates that altogether and says it's the responsibility of the board to make those changes, just like the board makes any other changes in ordinance without going to the voters. It's just part of the responsibility of being in that position. The voters can, of course, always petition. 5% can always petition if they want to challenge an ordinance that the select board has put into effect. We took a step in this direction last year, and this just takes it the rest of the way. The next section looks at the exemptions that we did for in Act 250 for within the core of downtowns and how many housing units and whether the 5x10 would apply to units there. And it just extends it to what is supposed to be around the time that we have within the bill, the larger bill that we're contemplating, the new provisions take effect. Just extends it for a couple of years. And then when you go to section 669, and anyway, it's just to make it clear that the department can hire staff. Some of this is pretty simple stuff, and embeds the program. Department may cooperate with and sub-grant funds to state agencies and political subdivisions and public-private organizations in order to carry out the purposes of the section that has tended to be done year at a time through language in the appropriations bill. This is just embedding it into statute. And the next section that refers to the 5-year forgivable loans, and also there's 10-year forgivable loans, of just kind of making clear that forgivable loans are going to tend to be the vehicle for VHIP doing rehab of individual houses rather than grants, because grants can have tax consequences and the forgivable loans tend to work better. It's where the program's headed. It's just sort of putting that into statute, institutionalizing it. And that's effectively it. So it's mostly technical corrections and just a few places where policy might need to be tweaked to actually implement what we passed in S1, try to more fully implement what we passed in S100 last year.
Thank you, Representative Bongartz. Representative Sakowitz.
Section on ADUs and short-term rentals. How is it envisioned that that's enforced?
I'm not sure I can answer that. We'll have to have the department, frankly, to talk about the specifics and exactly where the stuff came from. But I think it's for the benefits of it's benefits of the program. I don't know how it would be enforced. As we know, every time we have discussions about STRs, that question is always asked because it is hard. Somebody have to have some way to track and know what's actually happening on the ground once they're.
And then like over what period of time too? So somebody could be complying with the law for 6 months, but then they lose their long-term rental and then decide to change to.
They may. I don't know if they have to sign like an affidavit at the end or through this. And, there's bank fraud, or there should be something potentially similar to that. I don't know that we'd ask the department about the mechanism for doing that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Representative Sibilia is going to
Take the seat.
introduce. H715, an act relating to climate change resilience under Act 250.
So I'm going to tell you a story first, of course. And here's the story. Where I live is pretty rural. The bottom of a mountain close to the headwaters of the Rock River in East Dover, Goose City. And I've lived there for about 20 years. And raised my kids there, part of their enduring memories of childhood will be Thanksgivings without power. So we have a wood stove, we have propane for cooking, so I accomplished Thanksgiving. But the power went out pretty frequently where we lived. Pretty rural. We were sort of used to it. Fast forward, I think it was 2018, working with our utility in the district that I represented before, the one I represent now, gathered a number of municipal officials to meet with our utility and to really learn about what was happening with the weather and how rapidly it was changing, and really their concerns about a need to move the lines out of the woods to the roadways, to harden that infrastructure and to move it underground. Extremely costly to continue to repair, and obviously not good for Vermonters who don't have a wood stove and propane in the middle of winter. So I felt really good about that. My utility moved forward, working on a plan to work on climate grid resilience and hardening the grid. And despite the fact that the outages were increasing as the weather is getting worse and worse, including frequency and duration of how long, I was not really alarmed until last year. And folks will remember, may remember, in my district, which is about 125 miles away from Representative Buss, we had 3 multi-day outages between December and March, which got me a little excited and asking questions about what's going on here. My constituents are getting really distressed and feeling like they're in danger. You know, I had neighbors with their kids sleeping in the car to stay warm. And yes, I did offer them the couch. And we ended up last year passing an exemption to what I had learned was a problem, and that was Act 250 permits to rebuild some of the infrastructure in southeastern Vermont, in the District 2 region in particular. And we did that last year. We got to the end of the year, and it occurred to me that it was really, really difficult to actually get that exemption passed. You may not all have known this, but there was some pretty significant opposition to that exemption. And I kept saying to myself, how can people not want to fix this? How can people not want to fix this? Don't they understand that my neighbors have to sleep in their car, that somebody's health equipment might not be working? And so I am not an expert in Act 250. And I said to my utility, I don't know what happened here with this situation, but I'm going to dig it. And I did, and dug into multiple permits. The first thing I did was asked Natural Resources Board to help me understand how many permits were being applied for to rebuild existing infrastructure. And in my region, there was an anomaly when I looked, and there were multiple permits that had taken a very, very long time. And there were 2 permits that had taken more than 3 years to be issued to move existing electric infrastructure out of the woods and to the roadway. I'm still getting mad about it, so I might cry. That's not okay. That is not okay in an era where we have increasing weather, extreme weather, and we have people that are reliant on electricity for their safety and well-being. And in digging in that, there were a number of things that I found this bill proposes to address, several of them. And at its core, looks to really exempt regulated entities moving critical infrastructure from permit. I mean, we're not talking about entities that are not under public under the public purview. And it also looks to, I don't know how else to say this, to really eliminate pockets of unchecked power and increase safety valves within the appeals system, the permitting system, and to add more transparency. So very briefly, Section 1 sets about adding a purpose to Act 250, and that purpose being not only conservation, but to ensure that we build critical infrastructure in ways that is in keeping with our need to conserve, but acknowledges we need critical infrastructure for Vermonters. Section 2 repeals the sunset. The exemption that we passed last year sunsets. It's temporary. Section 2 would remove that sunset and make that a permanent. Section 3 and 4 were miscommunication between myself and Ledge Council and are not intended. Section 5 speaks to the issue of completeness that you heard Representative Buss discuss. That in one of the permits that I was researching, we had 3 people in the applicant who were aware that there was a disagreement about a jurisdictional opinion that was basically tied up and stalled for years, and thousands of Vermonters were being impacted. Their reliability was being impacted by that. And the question I kept asking everyone is, who should have raised their hand and said, even if we have bad actors here, someone should have been able to see that there was a problem, that this reliability problem was not getting resolved. So Section 5 looks at completeness. If an application needs to be deemed complete at 6 months, if it's rejected as complete, the applicant can take it to the board for a hearing. And I think, as you said, Madam Chair, that's something that we're considering, that you've proposed on your bills, or that has been proposed. Section 6, looking at providing technical assistance to applicants in advance to make sure that we expedite and move projects along. It also adds notice to, not standing, but notice to the RDCs and legislators in the municipality where the project is located. Why? Literally to make sure that just a few more people know that there's a permit, and perhaps a really critical permit that is happening in the region. Those are my notes on the budget. Section 7 would update the wetlands rules. So this was an Act 250 exemption. This would update the wetlands rules to exempt electric utilities, the movement of electric utilities out of wetlands to the right of way as well. And an effective date of July 1st, 2024. And that, I think, is all that I wanted to say about that.
Thank you. Representative Smith.
Yeah. Will this still allow utilities to go through wetlands if they have to?
I believe so. Yeah. This is the language that we have in here, I believe, is to move it out. You don't need, so you're able to move it out of, and I'm sure that if we take this up, that there'll be utilities.
If a project did come along.
Yeah.
And they had to go straight through a wetlands, would they be able to? Or
There's
is,
best management practices that the utilities are required to utilize when they're putting in poles. So I would,
Any other questions, Representative Pat?
One question, one comment. Have you, I know which utility you're affected by and you've been dealing with. Have you talked with any of the other utilities about it?
I have, and we really, if you think about landmass, as you know, Representative Pat, we have 3 utilities that are dealing really with most of the landmass and are dealing with most of the rural areas. The other two utilities, and the one, my utility, I'm not sure if they also have wetlands. I imagine they probably do have wetlands issues as well, but this was the one that was really holding up a number of cases. The other utilities have really raised the wetlands issue as a bigger issue for them in terms of moving critical infrastructure.
I know the utility, rural utility I'm familiar with, for many, many years has been capital budgeting to move lines out of the woods and to the roadside for all of these reasons. And just point out that those lines were originally built in an open field in the late 1930s, and then eventually, for
Everything grew up.
various other reasons,
Yeah.
ended up being in the middle of the woods. So that's one question. And the other thing, as I keep thinking about this discussion, I keep noting that when a project does not meet the definition that it's Act 250 jurisdiction, and it's before the PUC, whether it's a line relocation, a substation, or a power plant, if it's approved, it gets what's called a certificate of public good.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important piece of words, because that is a criteria that weighs very much in addition to the environmental impacts of whatever is being proposed. Is this in the public interest to have happen?
Yes. Madam Chair, I would add just one more thing because I think it will be relevant later on. As a result of this issue, which was really distressing to learn about, my RPC has actually taken a step of asking all of the other RPCs to share with them how they process and weigh in on Act 250 applications for critical infrastructure. So.
Representative Bongo.
Just curious, why do you need a permit to no longer be in a wetland? Which you said remove from a wetland to.
It would.
Well, along the road.
Oh,
You wanna be
I thought it was.
It would
You were talking about taking them out of an existing wetland.
update the wetland rules to exempt electric utilities from required wetland permits for resiliency projects involving power line relocation near or in roadside rights of way.
You're
Well, confusing.
You are in, yeah. Okay, thank you for that. So, members, those were the bills that we had, a couple of reasons those bills were picked to walk through. One is that there was direct Act 250 stuff in them, and we're working on that. But another was that we were asked, we would consider moving the recreation bill to the Agriculture and Forestry Committee. The Mike Rice's bill, H673, an act relating to Vermont's recreation outdoor economy. And so I just wanted you all to be aware of it, noodle on it, and I think they're ready to take it up. You have thoughts on that?
Mike,
Which
what
one?
would be the
73.
Okay, so I think we're talking about a study. And then developing the best management practices that would relate to us as well, but it's largely study analysis.
Yep.
So I wouldn't have a problem sending it over.
Representative Tory?
Yeah, I would agree because there was a previous bill last year that they did some work on. So I think it's a good thing for them to take up, but I appreciate your.
Other thoughts? All right. Any other thoughts on these bills? Before we adjourn for the day. Tomorrow, we're going to shift gears back into renewable energy standard in the morning and
9 o'clock.
9 o'clock. See you all then.